Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our page, and we're happy to see you all. My name is Lori Barrientos Sanchez, and my pronouns are they, them, and she, her. I'm the Director of Operations for Busboys and Poets Books. Busboys and Poets Books is an independent bookstore that strives to really support the Busboys and Poets spirit of being a cultural hub for artists, activists, writers, thinkers, and dreamers. Tonight, we have the distinct pleasure of being joined by Jon Hale, he, him, professor of educational history at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and author of The Choice We Face: How Segregation, Race, and Power Have Shaped America's Most Controversial Education Reform. This, quite honestly, drew me in when I saw the book at first, when it was hitting basically all of the bookstores' front list, and wondering, wow, okay, education reform, it's a huge field, and Jon really gets to the crux of how, honestly, exactly as the title goes, segregation, race, and power intersect to really affect what public schooling and non-public schooling looks like for our kids today. And today is actually the book's release day, and we're honored that Jon is here and able to join us to celebrate it. Along with Jon today, we have the privilege of having Nolue Brooks, she, her, author of Cutting Schools, The Segronomics of American Education, an interdisciplinary scholar. And quite honestly, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring our guests on screen because they can tell you all a lot more about education, the state of it, and where we're at here in the United States. Hi, everyone.
Hi, thank you, Lori. Thank you for having me. And Jon, thank you for this book.
Thank you.
You know, I'm a complete fan of it. We don't agree on everything, which we may get to at some point. But I really do think that you did something here, something necessary. So let's get started. Did you want to say anything to...
Nope, thank you.
Nope, you're ready to go? Okay.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you. And yeah, let's go get started.
So, I love your writing. Here's one of the things. You are a good storyteller. It's one thing to be a scholar, right? To have the facts and the figures. It's something else to be able to shape it into a compelling story. And you start the book really with the story of what brought you to thinking about choice as connected to white privilege, racism, segregation, and you started in South Carolina. So I'm wondering if you can sort of introduce whoever's here with us to the book through that story.
Yeah, so in many ways, the book released today, The Choice We Face with Beacon Press, started in 2014, 2015, when I was living and teaching at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. And I was teaching courses on the history of the civil rights movement, history of the Southern Black freedom struggle, and history of education, just in courses, really, and then teaching them in Charleston, South Carolina, which, the cradle of the Confederacy, one of the sites of enslavement that really defined the United States. And I was, of course, paying attention to educational reform in the community. And there was choice that has devastated Charleston. There are not a lot of traditional public schools left. There's only one traditional public school left in the downtown area of Charleston or the peninsula, and it's a predominantly Black school called Burke High School. And it was on the chopping block, so to speak. People were proposing that they convert Burke High School into a charter school. And that really sort of captured my attention and inspired engagement above and beyond the classroom, and also an engagement above and beyond academic writing, because here was the last traditional public high school in the city of Charleston, which is historically Black and remains over 98% Black today. And people were talking about closing it down or converting it to a charter school. And what I noticed, there were a lot of white progressives who were paying a lot of money to live literally across the street from Burke High School, but wouldn't send their own children to the school. They lived in the neighborhood, which is good enough for them, but not to go to the school. So here, it becomes a very contentious debate where white parents are demanding a charter school, demanding to reform the school in their own visions. And it was very problematic because they were relying on this notion of school choice. And here I'm emerging from the college classroom where I teach choice and the history of choice. It's grounded as a way to avoid desegregation. But there was a disconnect between how people were talking about converting Burke High School into a charter school and what the actual history was. And then that same summer that we're having these very intense debates, and it spills over to social media, and there may be a few calls placed to my dean about why I'm at these meetings and speaking in defense of a traditional public school, because we shouldn't be political. And the AME.
I'm sorry, going to a community meeting about a public school in Charleston counts as political?
Yeah. But, because if there's vested business interest in converting a public school to a charter school, and people have certain vested interest in that, people will contact and say, you're being too political, you shouldn't be doing this, are you using college resources to do this? So it becomes inherently a conflict of interest, according to the state of South Carolina, in many ways. And nothing happened. I mean, it just it was a contentious debate, and it remains to this day. But that summer is the summer of the AME horrific murder of white supremacy. Dylan Roof walks into the AME church and murders 9 churchgoers at a Bible study. And Charleston, reaches out, and everyone holds hands, and they forgive, and they say there's no hate in this city, and we're going to move forward. And President Barack Obama comes and sings Amazing Grace, and there's sort of a peaceful moment, but one that is fraught with conflict, and that denies the reality that this is a deeply divided city. And education and education reform was one of these key divisions in it. So really the choice we face starts in these community meetings, starts with these engaging in the discussions about, working with the last traditional public high school, which is historically Black in Charleston. And the book really comes out of this moment.
As you were talking, I have a piece that I did on the closing of one of the last traditional schools in New Orleans, which was a beloved school in the Black community. I mean, they educated huge numbers of middle class. It just occurred to me that's actually an interesting project, if anybody's out there looking for a project, to trace some of the history of some of these schools that are the last to close in the face of this onslaught of choice. But in any case, what I really want to talk about, because we're facing so much right now in this rhetoric of choice, this idea of choice, this idea that choice is some kind of a right, is very much under discussion as we do mask mandates and we do vaccines, and it's all really centering around schools and the rights of parents to decide what it is that is going to happen with their kids, or the rights of parents to decide what kind of information is taught in the school. Like this whole idea about choice and the right to choose really is undergirding a whole lot that we're seeing, I think, in education today writ large. And you really kind of trace the history, some of the history of where that comes from. What tell us something about how it is that this idea of choice becomes a right. Because we were talking before, choice is not actually in the Constitution as any kind of right. There's no amendment for, for choice. We got the Choice Amendment, there neither is education. But so that both of these have become this kind of ground zero. How does this thing that sounds like a no-brainer good, choice, how does it become so contentious?
Well, and then to your point, Dr. Brooks, about actually I had a conversation with my editor about the title of the book, and that the idea of throwing out that choice could be too broad. Is it or right to choose, right? In what way is this a right to life? Is this what kind of choice are we talking about in a right to choose? So the term itself is incredibly fraught with conflict and tension and discourse and debate, right? But what I noticed again in Charleston was the way a lot of white parents would claim and demand that they have a right to choose, that the government, local, state, or federal could not tell them where to go to school, that this was somehow this was seen as an inherent right. And to your point, and as we know as scholars that and authors and advocates, that we don't even provide, the United States Constitution doesn't even provide a right to an education. We're one of the few countries that actually don't provide that. Yet people are claiming that there's a right to choose where to go to school. So there's just a misunderstanding that this right actually doesn't exist. It's something that we're claiming, and it's grounded in entitlement and privilege. When someone claims they have a right to choose, there's a historic misunderstanding, but it's also more than likely a claim to say you want to control an aspect of a particular school. Right. So we're making these grand claims that aren't grounded in any type of legal definition, right, or provision of the United States Constitution. But we begin to see this right, or this claim for a right to choose, in the 1950s. Really, in 1955, after Milton Friedman publishes his work on the role of government in education, and after Southern segregationist lawyers and politicians begin talking about a right to freedom of association, which they interpret as a right to determine where you want to go to school, because the government shouldn't tell you where to go to school. And this is a direct reaction to desegregation orders, where the judicial branch, Supreme Court on down, was beginning to tell Southern school districts that they had to desegregate. You have to desegregate these schools. So people were saying, you have no right to tell me what school to go to. I have a right to choose. At the same time, so here's this right to choice. People start beginning to create this lexicon that's still with us today about a right to choose where to go to school.
And they want to choose to go to school with other white people, basically.
Exactly. And also, here's, interestingly enough, this is where you begin to see discussion. The previous administration of someone else's president begins talking about government schools. And I'm shocked. I'm hearing people know where government schools coming from. This was Ku Klux Klan, white citizens councils. They brand desegregated schools as government schools. But sure enough, DeVos and Trump and others begin talking about government schools. And we see this lexicon still with us today. So this right to choose is grounded in a strong white supremacist desire to avoid going to schools with Black children and children of color. And that's where this right develops. And today it's an unquestioned right to choose. And that's highly problematic.
But that one of the things that I think is interesting about your book is you do tell that history of post-Brown segregation academies and massive resistance. The beginnings where people start talking about the roots of charter schools come out of this period. This idea about choice and early vouchers and stuff. But you also trace, I think, in interesting ways, the ways that Black people in the 70s and 80s really begin to press on that idea of choice as a civil right. And despite the history that of the white supremacist history that the idea of choice comes out of, you really paint a nuanced picture of it, how in the 70s and the 80s, people who understand themselves to be in the interest of Black communities and in the interest of Black children who live in those communities and who come out of a Black Power, civil rights, Black Power formal kind of framework, begin to call on that rhetoric of choice as a way of pushing back against this idea of the schools that their kids are going to. Can you kind of flesh some of that out just a little bit?
So choice, like everything in 2021, it's complicated. And there's numerous lenses we can use to understand it. So one of the aspects I wanted to bring up in school choice is it really depends on our racial positionality, our relationship to schools based on our race, about what choice means. And it can mean different things to different groups of people depending on who we are. Like there's no monolithic, or there's no one universal understanding of there's no understanding necessarily of choice and what it means for everybody. Because what you begin to see in the late 1960s and 1970s is you begin to see Black advocates turn away from the goals of integration and desegregation, because desegregation is leading to what we now identify as a school-prison nexus. It's leading to discriminatory discipline policies. It's leading to a massive exodus and termination of tens of thousands of Black teachers. So desegregation is not working in the best interest. And W. Du Bois had talked about this for decades. So the civil rights movement and the Black power struggle begin to demand community control of their own schools. We have Malcolm X Liberations in North Carolina, Malcolm X Liberation College in North Carolina, for instance. We have strikes and community unrest in New York over community control in Ocean Hill, Brownsville neighborhoods, right? About who gets to control the school. So when Black advocates demand control of their schools, it sounds like and relates to, it connects with ideas of school choice. We shouldn't have to go to a school. We shouldn't have to go on a bus necessarily to go sit next to white kids, for instance. We shouldn't have to go to a school that has hateful white teachers teaching our children. Let's control our own education. This feeds into the choice mindset, because people, if a community or families want to determine what school they want to go to, that fits and connects with the definitions of school choice. Let's go start a charter school and come up with our own textbooks, our own tests, our own way of teaching, right? And call it a charter school. Well, that's a charter school to some, but that could be community control and community empowerment to other people. So I try to pay careful attention to the Black civil rights struggle and the Black power movement, because there's a certain intersection between a community control and a demand for community control in the school choice movement today, which is one reason why so many, or there's a lot of Black advocates and advocates of color who actually support choice, because it is one means to community control.
Do you want to, I was giving you a hard time about one of the main figures in your book, but as a way of kind of sketching that out, I'm just not going to say his name, but as a way of kind of sketching out some of how that works. Do you want to maybe talk about his trajectory, where he starts, he who shall not be named, where he's, I mean, you can name it.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and name Howard Fuller, who's, you know, in many ways a controversial figure. In many ways, the press has really looked at Howard Fuller as sort of a spokesperson, oftentimes self-identified spokesperson of a school choice movement. One of, what the American public wants to believe, one of the rare African-American advocates for school choice, when in fact there are many, but he's sort of taken the stage, if you will, as a school choice advocate. Because his trajectory is so interesting. He joins the civil rights movement in Cleveland, Ohio through the Congress of Racial Equality Corps, and he becomes involved with the desegregation struggle in Cleveland. He moves to North Carolina and helps found and lead Malcolm X Liberation University. He joins freedom fighters in Eastern Africa and Tanzania and really embraces the principles and the life of a Black power advocate in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Well, he emerges again in the United States press in the city of Milwaukee in the late 1970s, where he's proposing an all-Black school district, because they're proposing taking his alma mater, North Division High School, and turning it into a magnet school, so a choice model, which would inevitably attract white students to a predominantly Black school and would push out Black students who were living, again, in the same district of the school. It would actually push out Black families to make space for white families. Again, it's putting the onus of desegregation on the backs of African-American families. So Howard Fuller emerges from this as an advocate for an all-Black school district. Well, the politics of the state of Wisconsin end up scrapping that idea, but sort of proposing private school and religious school vouchers, which Howard Fuller ultimately supports, because in his estimation, it's one way to sort of achieve community control and better schools for Black students. But in this process, he's working with the GOP. He's working with Governor Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin. He eventually meets with George W. and George H.W. Bush eventually becomes and befriends Betsy DeVos, right? One of the notorious privatizers in American history of schools. So he takes on this sort of role of a Black advocate in school choice and is a lightning rod for criticism from all sides. So I follow his story to talk about the complexity and nuance of school choice advocacy. It's not just white families. There are Black advocates, there are Latinx advocates who are claiming school choice, but for different reasons. Mm-hmm. And we have to understand why people are making these demands for school choice if we are going to really address the root causes of public education failure today.
Yeah, which is a good, as we were talking earlier, we were agreeing that one of the kind of under discussed, I think, in public at least, issues around public schools is between Brown v. Board, between the whole desegregation model and choice. So those have really been at a federal level, at a state level, at a national level. Those have been the two tools that we've had in the 20th and 21st century to try and get at this issue of equity, educational equity. Mm-hmm. And for a variety of reasons that are not the same, you could really say both are abject failures. I mean, if there was a wide, and for integration, of course, it wasn't allowed to actually, when it was allowed to kind of work okay, it did some things. Mm-hmm. But it everything that we see about the hardening of segregation, we're now seeing not segregation academies, we're seeing white communities in places like Memphis actually just pick up and start their own whole school districts, right? Or in Alabama, I mean, there's a few places where people are like, forget a segregation academy where we're still living in the same place. We are just going to draw a whole different boundary, take our tax dollars, and it's majority white and majority upper income who are able to kind of navigate a process to succeed. So, integration, I don't know that it's been allowed to work. And then we could talk some about what we consider working. And then school choice, which since at least Clinton going forward, a majority of what's coming out of the federal government in terms of how we're going to fix what's broken has to do with choice. And people want to start it with Trump and DeVos. It starts before that. It's very much the vision of the Obama White House. It's very much the vision by the end. Wait, did I disappear? Can you still see me? No?
Yeah, I can
still hear me. Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
It's very much the vision, of course, of the Bush White House. So we have these two tools that haven't worked in all of this time, and neither of the tools. One, I want to talk about that, right? Like, I just want to talk about what it is. What is it? Hard-headed? Is it like we have things that are not actually working? And what happens, though, is the public schools, which are undereducating certain kids and have undereducated those kids for a really long time, are sort of left to just continue to uneducate people while all of our focus is on integration fights or school choice. And the entity that's actually educating the majority of kids in this country, not in some cities. There's some cities where it is true that charter schools are the majority, but as a whole, the institution of public education is left pretty much uninterrogated, or it's like, well, either we're going to integrate it into healthy, or we're going to choice it into healthy. They have both failed. How has that happened? This may not exactly be what's in your book, but we started talking about it. It's sort of like, I'm just like in talking to you, so let's continue it. How does that happen? But what do we do about it?
So one, about sort of how did it happen? I mean, I think I don't want to sound too cynical, but maybe it's the time of day and just I think everything going on, because we see these contradictions of choice where Southern governors are beginning to tell people that they can't pass mask mandates. So it's, well, where's the choice there? If you believe in people, where is it, right? So there's incredible contradictions that it's so hard in the pandemic to sort of, to sort of address, right? But how this happens is that the system, did not sound too cynical, but the system itself is never designed to benefit the majority of people in the United States. It's always historically been an exclusive institution aimed to serve the vested interests of the elite. And we've never really sort of, especially with choice, moved beyond that. So the system itself, arguably and historically, isn't supposed to benefit everybody. So when we start asking those questions, we're at a real loss about how to make that happen. So with integration, and really I think we could call it desegregation, because we've never achieved true integration to the point where we really sort of collapse these racial boundaries. But even so, we spend, the better part of the 20th century trying to achieve even a semblance of desegregation. And there's so much energy put into this from the judicial branch and enforcing desegregation, and Southern schools going through this process of desegregation. And when we get there, and even we have Thurgood Marshall at the Supreme Court finally to sort of oversee some of this, and he's even scratching his head, right, and probably having a drink or two on the side, because the Brown decision has just sort of not only unrealized, but leading, as you're pointing to abject failure for Black families and families of color in the United States. Because with desegregation and the attempt to integrate schools, it basically is interpreted across the United States. Now, not every location is like this, right? But generally speaking, it's a one-way street of Black students going to white schools. There's this notion that Black students have to sit next to white students in order to prove their education. And that's just not true, but that is how the process sort of played out. And it also meant putting Black students in front of white teachers. So we have a massive, not only exodus, but actual termination of employment of tens of thousands of Black teachers, which explains the lack of Black teachers in today's teaching force. So desegregation, it just doesn't work. It's not working. There's some statistical improvement, as I point out in the book, but generally speaking, it's not leading to the promises of the Brown decision.
Because of the resistance of white communities and families. Like there's very specific, I just want to say, like, it's a nice idea on paper, but it was not really accounting for the massive resistance that people were going to have to even one child.
And Derek Bell talks about what, he's quite critical of the Brown decision toward the end of careers, but he asks the question when he's actually working with Howard Fuller in the few pieces he publishes about, well, what happens if, instead of giving sort of arbitrary numbers about desegregation or quotas, if you will, what happens if you said there had to be Black and Brown representation on school boards? What happens if a certain percentage of teachers had to be Black or Brown? If we asked a different question that aimed at structural inequality, but we didn't, it was a one-way street, and the project, to your point, ultimately fails. So choice becomes a solution, a panacea, a silver bullet, and people latched onto that, right, as a way to improve what they saw as a broken system. And it also individualized it. What can I do as an individual to get the best education for my child in a school? But all of a sudden we lose the question that integration brings up of the collective good and the public good. All that's lost in that. So what do we do? I mean, that's at least several other books, but there's bunch out there. But right now, choice is essentially choice masks and it ignores the deep issues, and it prevents us from really looking at that question because we spend so much time.
Yeah, I feel like both have been huge distractions at this point that have functioned. I mean, we have always, as you said, had an education system that was always skewed toward the most privileged, the highest status, and the fight has always been how to include others in that. But we really are looking at a system that has it's almost like they are just not going to educate poor kids, Black kids, Latinx kids, kids who come from a certain kind of strata. The whole system has always just been like, we're just not going to do it. And integration as a strategy, as well as choice as a strategy, which again is what we've had, has allowed us to not actually even really fully name and try to fix what's broken in public education. Some of what you said, one of the things that we know is that having a diverse teaching force by itself, quality, we're always wanting to stick kind of brown and Black faces places and go, we fix something. Like, okay, like actual people who care about the Black children or brown children that they're teaching, who don't want to demonize them, who don't want to, but actual, I'm here to help for real because I'm one of you. We don't have any of those, but we've demonized teaching to such an extent. Well, who in their right mind is going to try to become a teacher? But we know just that you get some teachers in the classroom, you really help. We know if you go into too many low-income urban areas for traditional public schools, what you're talking about are buildings that are horrifying. There was a report done, I live in Providence now, and just sort of checking out what's going on with the Providence schools, which have just been taken over by the state a few years ago. And they called in a team of researchers from Johns Hopkins to give them a snapshot, of what are our schools here, like Providence, which a district, Providence proper, the district is like 80-something% Black, and the teachers are 70-something% white or whatever. One of these researchers who does this for a living came out of the school building and said she had to excuse herself because she was broke down in tears because the way that the building looked, how the building had been allowed to deteriorate, the conditions that these children were expected and in fact dealing with was something she hadn't seen since images that were supporting Brown v. Board, like the images that went along with the Quirkies, where you're kind of, and you're like, but this is, 2 years ago. Here, this is a broken system. And saying that we're just going to integrate it over the pitched resistance of white people, for the most part, and high status people pitched, or we're going to school choice it. We're going to we're going to just pick parts out. We're just going to do what's best for the individual. We're just that's not. It's tragic to me. It is tragic to me that we are at a point where nobody's actually looking at the system or proposing any actual solutions for the system other than get rid of it.
Get rid of it and replace it with some private option model, right, or something like that. And then also, it's just, if you take the idea that the system doesn't work, it's not profitable. It doesn't fit the American ethos to sort of go in these schools and really work with what's there, right? Because that takes too much time. We're not going to see, a potential turnaround for 10 plus years. That takes too long, and our kids will be out of school. And if it's individualized, we don't care about the long term,
right?
Collective, right? So, but then also this idea that we've been studying the issue, and we've been going to these schools for over 100 years. And if you listen and work with those who are in schools, teachers and families and students, especially students, we have solutions, but we don't allow, because we trust a CEO with millions of
consultant.
A consultant.
Mm-hmm. Or a tech billionaire, random tech billionaire.
Yeah. And we've invested in this idea that it should be run as a business. So let's bring in business people to run our schools rather than trusting and listening, and most importantly, empowering and investing those who are committed without charge or without, having this as their day job. It's just not structured for us to do that, right? So when we focus on choice and integration, we're really missing the larger problems, but then also the solutions that are right in front of us. It just requires more investment.
Agreed. I couldn't agree more, especially about how we rarely ask people, like the students, what would you do? You know, you're going to school here every day. How would you fix it? What would that look like? What would education look like to you? What would quality look like to you? What is your school, your ideal school? What does that look like? Like, we so rarely ask the people in those spaces at this point. We don't ask the teachers, we don't ask the parents anymore. And that is a function of the school choice movement. I believe in the last 20 years, it's been all about getting rid of community input, getting rid of parental input. You basically say, we'll educate your child to the highest levels, but or we'll educate your child so they can take a test and do well and may get into a good school. But don't come in here asking us about what we're teaching, how we're teaching, what's going on. We're going to need you to sign a compact, in fact, saying that you will just help them with their homework, and you will make sure they get to school on time, and then it's all about us. And you compare that with these empowered, overwhelmingly white families, it seems to me in this moment, who are all like, critical race theory. I mean, don't talk about racism in the classroom. Don't talk about, like, they feel fine with saying what's being taught and how it's being taught. And while the system that's supposed to fix the undereducation of Black people too often says, we don't want you, and we're going to get rid of school boards, like in case you don't get the message and try and offer your thinking about what's happening in this school district. No school boards for you. We're going to have mayoral control. We're going to have, state takeovers. We're going to have, it's really cynical. And I think that you do a good job, to my mind, of really pressing on some of the pressure points that I think are important for discussions of schools, but also just sort of some of what we see going on. Let me ask you, because, I'll just start talking. One of the things that this kind of comes out of this is how we all are so clear that public schools are awful. People are just, just clear. It's just an article of faith almost. They're terrible. Religious schools are better. Private schools are better. What is that trajectory? And I kind of think that we don't think all public schools are awful. We just think the ones that have too many Black and brown and poor people in them are awful, and we think that they're pulling down all of them. But that's what I think, what I suspect is the case. But where, and you talk about this some in the book, where does that idea of public schools are just trash, where does that come from?
So I trace it to Brown decision and desegregation. Because if you look at Gallup polls, for instance, during the 1940s, the American public largely viewed their public schools as quality institutions. They were supported their, looking at the gendered time period of the first half of the 20th century, they support their daughters if they went into teaching, right? We see higher approval ratings of public schools, even though it's segregated, right? So if you look at a Southern Black boy, you can see it very different, needing more funding, for instance, and resources. But you really start to see the downturn after the Brown decision and the attempt to even achieve a token level of desegregation, a very minimal level of desegregation, because you begin to see white flight, you begin to see massive resistance, you begin to see police and the National Guard outside of classroom doors, and this is broadcast all across the United States. Less than 10 years after the first desegregation of a small handful of students into white schools, you begin to see busing riots in the North. You begin to see, tens of thousands of white mothers protesting in New York and Chicago against busing. Throw into the mix, Watts and Detroit and Newark and these urban rebellions occurring, and you put it all together, and a middle-class white family is going to turn on the TV or listen to the radio and say, our schools are terrible. Look what's happening. I don't want to send my kid to a public school. So there's a general narrative across the board after desegregation and the attempts to achieve desegregation that public schools are just awful. spaces. And you see this reflected in the culture. So look at in the 1950s, for instance, I talk about in the book Blackboard Jungle, this idea that here are these urban spaces, and let's equate urban with Black, brown, and immigrant, right? That these are terrible spaces, and this is a cultural media production that people begin to sort of identify that public schools are terrible. So this narrative, and then you see President Nixon plays up on this, and he's anti-busing, and you know, just sort of this is passed down generation to generation, and we're telling stories not about our own public schools that we attend, but other people's public schools that are shaped by popular media and honestly just fear of desegregation and righteous demands for civil rights. That's enough to terrify white middle class families to get out of the cities, you know, white flight, and to invest in this idea of school choice, that no one's going to tell them to go to one of these dangerous, violent schools, that they can choose where they're going to go to school.
Yeah, so, it's sort of like how we're constantly hearing that cities are under attack. I don't know, there are riots in the street, you know, that like right now, all of a sudden, and people who are living in the cities are like, but I missed that. Like, what are we saying? But there's some media that is really invested in painting cities that have democratic mayors as incomplete free fall almost. And I agree. I think that the media, there's I have threatened in the past to do a paper on the representation, like how rare it is to even call up mainstream images of Black people being educated well, without trauma, without troops, without, you know, like just your Black people can also be educated, and there are spaces where that's happening, and they're not all, you know, that we need you to be a part of the military throwing candy bars and talking about Dylan in order to actually connect with and educate kids. And you just don't see it. I used to do a talk where I would ask people in the audience, college students, like, give me 3 images, popular images, not from your family, not from, you know, of black education that's not dysfunctional. And other than maybe some newspaper articles, usually they had some difficulty with, again, popular, mainstream, mass-produced, mass culture images, not those that are part of our niche programming. And that alone, I think, tells us quite a bit about where we are. So go ahead.
I was going to say, even if you look at something like Lean on Me, this idea of a stern Black educator kicking out, you know, kids, which is going to contribute
with
to
a bat, having a bat,
yeah, locking the door. It's crisis mode over and over again, right? Which no wonder why. I mean, it's not right, but when again these white parents in Charleston that I was constantly observing and interacting with in these meetings were afraid to step foot in Burke High School because of the things that I heard and saw. But if you actually walked into school, you saw that was so far from reality. But no one is actually taking those steps into the school to see for themselves that there's something wrong with this narrative, right? And we're just not investigating it ourselves.
So what haven't I asked you? I've sort of focused on the beginning. It's like a good academic. I kind of focused on, or a typical, if not good, a typical academic, the beginning and the end. What else is in the book that you want to make sure we have a chance to talk about?
And perhaps as a concluding note, I'm not sure, but something I think something that I became very interested in because I kept hearing it a lot, and oftentimes maybe not the most polite emails or debates or Twitter comments or whatever are sort of the defense of school choice. And I think really understanding kind of why people are defending it, especially white politicians or white families, is that they will say, well, Milton Friedman, who's the economist behind choice, was against segregation, right? And he did write that. He was personally against segregation. Well, but he supported the right of people to attend segregated schools if they want to, right? So they can say, well, they're not freedom of choice in plans. We moved in. But look at someone like Howard Fuller. They're going to point to sort of this idea that, oh, well, black people support it, so this must be okay, right? But we're at a moment in time where you have to see how racial equity and questions of racial equity, how they work into our discussions of school choice. And if we're not having those discussions, it's part of the problem. So if you're not asking about how this empowers communities, or how this can turn around or be a resource for communities, right? If we're not asking those questions, then it's part of the problem. And just, I think it's so important to see how school choice is not just a set of policies about vouchers or privatization or educational savings account. It's much more than that. It's a mindset. It's how we see it. And it's a historical mindset. How has this changed over time? So it's really asking us to sort of come to the table and really almost interrogate this idea that this has everything to do with our democracy as a multiracial democracy that's struggling, that's coming to a reckoning right now. And we have to see choice as part of that larger reckoning. And if we don't, we're going to continue what we were talking about before, missing all of, or ignoring, not thinking to look at these deep systemic issues, that if we have to put it in this proper context. And that's really something I wanted to do with this book, is to put it in context and keep the conversation going in ways that really focus on justice and racial equity.
Well, what I'm hopeful about, and I do think you do that, by the way, but what I'm hopeful is that at this moment where everywhere you look, I don't know how many states we're up to, it might be like 20, that are saying, oh, no talking about race at all, nothing that will make white people feel bad, nothing that, makes mention of many of these issues, like that it's impossible to talk about a history of education in the United States and not hit upon some of the things explicitly forbidden in places like Texas, who with excruciating detail, want to go through and tell you what you can and cannot teach, but also how you can and cannot make students feel, as if you can somehow be responsible for, you could be talking about the founding fathers and they feel offended by that. You don't know what's going to offend students, but you have these people coming up with, anyway. So what I'm hopeful, though, is that maybe because you're white, people will actually listen to this. They will not automatically, like, you can get these issues that about equity, about the history of choice, about the complicated nature of the history of education, about freedom, about white supremacy, what that looks like today, like that's all running throughout the book. And since we seem to be completely enamored with skin color these days, like people are like, yeah, as long as you're not, talking about things that upset me, but people seem a little touchier depending on the skin color of the person doing the talking. So I'm hopeful you can get some of these issues raised and really have a more complex conversation even about choice than we tend to have today, because we've slipped into this thing where, of course, parental choice. I even saw something about grandparent choice as a part of the masking and the school choice debate. Like now it's what about the rights of the grandparents? I don't remember in what context, but now, we're concerned about everybody's right. But none of these are rights that are actually protected in the Constitution. Yeah. And the rights that are protected in the Constitution are being eroded, and we're not even talking about.
And what is implied, at least in the Constitution, but then also in federal policy since the Northwest Land Ordinance, is this idea of a public good, that we need to set up schools for the public good. So what is written in the Constitution, we tend to ignore. And also, I think there's this false narrative, this mythology almost, that our schools are supposed to rise above politics, that schools aren't messy politics. We'll say that, but then we look in Virginia and there's parents scream about critical race theory, right? That's not a reality. It's hopefully it also can, in continuing this conversation, it's to shed the light that our schools and our classrooms have always been and will always be political spaces, and that's okay. But we have to see it and not feel ashamed that we're talking about politics with schools, because schooling and education is politics. And the sooner we can see that, it won't require courage to go to a school board. It will just be, this is what we have to do because this is part of the United States government. This is what it is, and we have to become involved in our schools, and we're not going to try to privatize it and pull out of it. Let's all get engaged and figure this out.
So figure out the school. Yes. Just by way of finishing on, if not a happy note, on a problem-solving note. So what's one thing you would call for? Would it be everybody getting involved that could help to fix, that could help to make your work anachronistic, that could help make like, oh boy, that was back in those days when those people were fighting over choice. What's one what's one thing that you can imagine? And
that's a problem, right? It'll sit on a shelf and become dated next year or something. Yeah. So it's better, keep something. I think one, it's because everyone inevitably asks for solutions, and it's a hard sell to say let's go to our public schools because they're broken and there's major problems. I think it's going to be to just sort of stop, listen, and as hard as it is, and I just went through a terrible experience this summer in terms of not doing as well as I could in terms of listening to those in school invested in it who have solutions and supporting them solely, just to stop, listen, and support the work on the ground, because every school, and this is a general principle, every school in the United States has a small group of parents or teachers or students or a combination thereof of people working to improve that school. So why do we have to come in with our own solutions, our own ideas? Why can't we just get behind those who are already doing the work? Chances are, again, without charging a consultant's fee, and they live there and they go to school there. Let's just, if there's a takeaway, let's get behind those folks who are doing the work and following them and pushing them forward, because ultimately that's where we're going to see solutions. So if it's just to sort of go down that path, I think we can start to see, reasons to get the choice we face off our bookshelves because we no longer need it. But we're going to have to start following those who are doing the work, because therein lies the solution.
I couldn't agree more. I have been playing with this idea of a people's public policy entity that's a way for, because public policy, it's like you call in a few people who like Howard Fuller, to give you, I said his name, see, but there was an eye roll. There was an eye roll too. So, but you call in the people that to come and make a presentation. You're sort of like, all voices are equal, or all of the voices that we who are politicians or foundation people or whoever you are that are calling forth folks because you want to move policy. We pick folks that we know and we like, and they make presentations to us. And then from those few presentations, or 500 presentations, however many there are, we then come up with policy. And then we go back to those people and say, does that work? And then, we pivot and then go to our elected representatives and get the policies passed. But we don't really have a way within that to be kind of vetting, but what voices are consistently asked to provide a certain kind of commentary. As I said, they invited a bunch of folks from Johns Hopkins to the Providence schools to give a report on what's working and what's not. I just got here, so I could be way off, but I'm gonna say there are people in this community who could tell you what's working and what's not, and probably you wouldn't charge you a fraction of what Johns Hopkins would charge you, assuming they charged anything. I don't know that they did. But the idea that what you go do when you want to fix a local problem is you go get folks who are not part of those communities, but are somehow experts, right? And I'm really like, we need some kind of space that's about on the local issue. And also the other thing I would say is we're always focusing on the federal government. And for education, to me, that makes no sense whatsoever, because the majority of the money, the majority of the issues, the way that schools actually function are much more localized than some other things. And to have it all be this top-down thing, I don't think that that's serving us very well. So I agree. Ask the folks, like, why is it we have this ethos where it never occurs to us to ask the people who are, you want to do prison reform, ask some people who are incarcerated what it is that I'm sure people are doing this. I do not mean to suggest that they're not, but you're so often hearing of people who we start somewhere else. We start somewhere other than with the people who are experts by the fact that they have these systems falling on them, and not all of them have solutions, but they have information, and we need a way. Because again, the way that we're doing it, from what I can see and what I can say, is it's not work. Things aren't fixed. We don't have any kind of roadmap to fix things in education, from what I can see. So, you know, why not do something completely different? So
yeah, and why not, you know, empower those who are historically marginalized in the process, right? It's not going to lead to anything worse than what's going on now. It's going to lead to, in fact, things that we've been
How can it be worse?
Yeah.
But choice, it could be worse. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I think that we're about out of time. We got no questions. I guess we were not that interesting to people, but I enjoyed talking with you a lot, and I really do hope that people read your book. I think that there's a lot in there. There's food for thought. I learned that this is in my wheelhouse, and there was quite a bit that I learned that I didn't know. So I want to say that people should rush forth to your independent bookstore, and you should avail yourself of this book.
And Dr. Brooks, thank you so much. And as you read the book, you'll see cutting school, wet the shoulder here, reference throughout the book. And thank you for not only taking the time to speak today, but just your work in pushing this conversation forward and being a resource and a guide for those who choose to write a book and to sift through all the material. So thank you for you've done all you're doing. And it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
This has been great. It's been nice to meet you. I hope you stay in touch. So I think we're a few minutes early, but I'm gonna call it. So
hey, bro. Thank you both so much. You all did a great outro for each other, so I'm not gonna linger too long. So we're gonna go ahead and say our goodbyes. See you all. And yeah, I would just want to say a special thank you again to our guest this evening. The phrase, "How could it be worse?" will stick with me after tonight. Please go ahead and follow them online at Twitter for more information and updates about their current and future projects. Come into Busboys and Poets 14th and V for copies if you want to visit us in store for The Choice We Face, or feel free to purchase online from our bookshop website at bookshop.org/shop/busboysbooks. Just search Choice We Face in the upper center search bar. Join us in person at Busboys and Poets 14th and V at 6 p.m. or tune in tomorrow, August 11th for Wanting, a program about why we want what we want and what it even means and why it matters. Thank you to everyone at home who joined us, and we hope you're staying safe and well. Good night, and see you all next time.